Hi guys, it's Andrew. I'm just thought I'd give you a little video on how the AMR stats for Entrevo work, and just walk you through how this all works. So, if you open up the Excel spreadsheet, you should see, for example, you've got a little section here called week, actual, average, and rolling. And this is around the calls that you make. So as an example, we've got week 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And based on the diary, you would plug in something like, okay, this week I made, say, 32 calls. In week 2, I made 27 calls. In week 3, I made 15 calls. Week 4, I made 19, and so on. Now, what you'll see over here in the average, as soon as you plug in your actual number of calls each week, in this column over here, it starts to you can see you've got the average of between 32 and 27 is an average. You're making an average of 30 calls a week there. Okay. By week 3, the average is actually, in this case, you dropped your actual number of calls, and so the average is now at 25. It went up a little bit in week 4, so the average is creeping down here. So if I wanted to get the average number of calls up, let's say I made another 35 calls, you can see that I'm still up at around 26. If I'm required to make 30 calls a week, for example, you can see that the drop rate is there. However, over in the rolling column over here, what it does is it takes the average of week 1 down to week 4 there, and it gives you the average over those 4 weeks. Okay, so which is the average number of calls that you're making is 23. In this one, it takes the average number of calls from weeks 2 down to 5. So it actually clusters that group of 4 and gives you the average for that number. Get the idea? So if I was to make an actual number of, say, let's say I did 43 calls that week, you can see that 28 is made up of that bunch of 4 weeks right there. So you get an average. And in week 6, I've got an average of 28 calls. So what does that mean to you? So with salespeople, one of the first things we do is we say, okay, what's the actual, what's the average, and what's your rolling average? It gives me an idea of performance, and we actually plot that. We create a graph, and as you can see here, we've got weeks 1, 2, 3, 4 along to weeks 12 there, and we've got the number of calls, which is over here. Now the blue line, this blue line here, is actually showing me the number of calls that you made. So in week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. So you can see about 16 calls there in week 3, and back up to about 43 calls here in week 6. The red line, which one here, it actually starts to plot the average. Now, the good thing about the average is over time, you should actually see it starts to plateau out at a certain level. But you can see it started high, it's tracking the actual number of calls, and it's following the dips, it's following the trend of your actual, but it's actually now starting to average those out. And you can see that what's happening is that it's starting to trend down to around about, say, 15 calls a week. All right, so we're getting down to here in this red line here. The one that I want to look for most, if I'm looking particularly at improving performance on something, if I just want to get your strike rate up, the one that I look at the most is this rolling average. And the rolling average, if you like, the actual tells me what actually happened. The average tells me what's been happening on average, but the rolling average tells me what's been happening lately. And in this case, you can see that that in weeks 4, 5, 6, and 7, it's pretty much been tracking, if you like, the average, but it's below. It's just touching below the average. You can see it's underneath there. And then obviously over time here, you see it's actually dropped right off. So you can see that performance is actually dropping off unless you change something, right? So the rolling average becomes a really important measure for us to actually watch. That's the one that I'm looking at. Let's just tweak some of these numbers so you can see what happens if I just tweak something. Let's say that my call rate here, I'll change this one up to 43, for example, and I'll change this one up to, say, 17. You can now see that there's the number of calls. There's the average number of calls is around the 33 mark, and our rolling average is about 35. So you can actually see that if I was just being tracked on calls alone, I'm actually overperforming because I'm actually above the average, which is probably where you want to be. Okay, but the thing about doing the actual average and rolling is compared to what? And in this case, we're comparing it to actual number of signups. So I've made these calls but how many people actually signed up. So let's just plug in some numbers over here and see what happens. So let's say that in week 1 that 8 people signed up, and then in week 2 12 people signed up, and in week 3 5, in week 4 7, in week 5 another 10, week 6 we did say 12 people, right? So you can now see that the average sign up is around about the 8 or 9 mark, okay, and that the rolling average is sitting around 9. And if we scroll down to the graph, you can see there's the average, there's the actual, there's the average is the red one, and you can see it's starting to. We really look up to around week 6. It's trending around the 8 per week mark, and we can see again with the rolling average here that it was sort of pretty much tracking the average. But you can see by week 6 and 7, it's actually starting to dip under. It's actually now starting to equal or dip under. So it's now trending downwards. So you can see by about week 7 there, we're starting to work below the average, which is underperforming. That would tell me that you've got to either get your call rate up, you've got to talk to more people, or you've got to improve the quality of the calls that you make to get those sign-ups. So look, just a really brief tool. This is just the actual calls you make. This is the result. We're making calls so people actually sign up and get on board. So this is why we're tracking, okay, the actual people running the campaign. So I rang 32 people and 8 people actually signed up to do the campaign. So we're comparing those two things. I hope that helps.